Hi, I'm Jon Meacham, the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at the Vanderbilt University, the co-chair of the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy, and delighted to welcome you to the last of our summer Unity Talks, which is not an oxymoron, so that's important to remember, with my good friend, the legendary, which also just kind of means you're old as well when you're described as legendary, Keel Hunt, columnist for USA Today Network, former special assistant to Lamar Alexander, and for our purposes, the author of a very important book called Crossing the Aisle, about bipartisanship in the state of Tennessee heading into the 21st century, and how, in a countercultural example to where we are now, the state of Tennessee, a big, complicated place, actually practiced a kind of unity that produced a more prosperous state. And what sort of where we are now, where we go forward, most important, the lessons from that experience for everybody. So you don't have to be a Tennessee dork, as Keel and I are, to get something out of this. So Keel, welcome and thank you. And I just want to kick off with a pretty basic question. Take us back to, say, 1990 or so in the state of Tennessee. Today, a very red state, but put us back 88, 90, 92. Tell us who was in office. Tell us what the forces were and what that helped produce in that decade.
Good question. Thanks, John. 1990 was, to me, as I try to describe in the book Crossing the Aisle, it was what I call the in-between time, and that refers to how Tennessee was a thoroughly blue state, up until toward the middle of the 1980s. And then now we're not, right? I mean, we're in so many different measures, composition of our congressional delegation, makeup of our legislature, who holds the three statewide offices. It's almost today well, it pretty much is the opposite of what the state politically was then. And there are a lot of good and important reasons why that happened. Why the in-between time became bookended by these sort of hyper-partisan periods. In 1970, I'll dip back a little bit deeper than you asked, but in 1970, Winfield Dunn was elected governor from Chattanooga. Basically, nobody who practiced politics had ever heard of him. He was a dentist in Memphis, and had been the chairman of the local county Republican Party. But he and some other close associates, Harry Welford, certainly Howard Baker from the east end of the state, had already been pretty successful in their goal to make Tennessee a bipartisan, voting state. Howard Baker had been elected in the 60s, and so in 1970, Winfield Dunn was elected governor, surprising everybody in the political establishment. And in the process, a lot of other names who we now generally know well came into the picture of our politics in the state. And one was Lamar Alexander, who was Winfield Dunn's campaign manager at that point. He'd previously worked for a little while in the Nixon White House, and others. And so it didn't happen overnight, of course. Alexander was elected in 78, and he had run once before in 1974. This is actually the year I met Lamar, when I was a reporter for the Tennessean newspaper covering his campaign in 74. But he lost that race to Ray Blanton, and that opened up a whole other storyline that is pretty
Right.
well known now.
That's the true crime version that we'll get into later.
That's right. That's right.
So we live in a moment now in 2022 where law enforcement and the complicated, porous border between political malfeasance and potential criminality, this is all very top of mind right now in the country. Right. How do you enforce the law in a partisan atmosphere? Tennessee has a live example, historical example of how that can happen.
Yes, sir.
And so if you would, take us to 1978, Lamar Alexander has won the governorship. Ray Blanton, a Republican, Ray Blanton, a Democrat, is in the governor's mansion. Take it from there.
Well, this did become a turning point, but in particular, they so Ray Blanton, Democrat, had been elected governor in 1974. There were so many Democrats running in that primary that year. There were a dozen Democrat candidates that Blanton actually won the Democrat nomination with only 23% of the primary vote. So we don't have runoffs in state primaries even now. And so he got in kind of on a fluky vote. And so then the nominees, and Alexander got the Republican nomination that summer. So all this crowded field is down to these two guys as the party nominees. Well, leading up to the November election, a couple of big things happened. One was President Nixon has resigned. Leader of the Republicans nationally, and not only that, but I need to check my calendar. But so within a month or so of the general election, the new president, Gerald Ford, pardons Nixon. And Alexander has told me again recently about the day he and Honey, Alexander, were having dinner at home. The phone rings, and Senator Baker, who has been his mentor, for several years, was calling, and he said, "Well, what do you think this will have?" Well, Alexander had not been tuned into the news. He said, "Well, what do you mean? What's happened?" He says, "Well, President Ford has pardoned Richard Nixon." Well, they could, immediately sense that this is going to throw a lot of their political calculations into a cocked hat. As Lamar said later, he sensed that every Republican in the East Tennessee mountains proceeded to come down trying to identify who was the Republican nominee for anything, any office, because they wanted to vote against him for that. So this created, obviously, some upheaval. Blanton then, who was the 23% nominee of his party, then beats Alexander. And so you had this succession of sort of oddball in terms of conventional politics happen. And then in November, first week of November, Alexander loses to Blanton, and who has the office for 4 more years. He thought, well, Blanton, of course, was, for various reasons, was immediately of interest to the FBI. And there turned out to be a lot of, bad behavior on the part of not just the governor's office. I mean, it was the clemency for cash scandal that emanated from the governor's staff and so forth that caught, public attention most of all. But there were other crimes that were being investigated, turned out, in terms of state property disposition, highway construction. I interviewed a former FBI agent in writing that book, and And by the way, those guys are pretty good. They don't give up much, even in retirement, but let alone when they're in the active service. But he said, well, Keel, all the public attention came to the clemency business. But in terms of dollar value, that was really the least of the trouble. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the serious money by way of bribes and so forth was in the highway construction business. And indeed, there were people who convicted for that and went to prison, including Governor Blanton's brother and others. So anyway, this caused a big kind of rip in the norm of how things got done on Capitol Hill in Nashville. And so you suddenly had this outlier Republican governor, I mean, a young man, Alexander was at that time, in a building full of Democrats. And yet he had to fashion a way forward so that there could be, in the framework of divided government, progress to be made. And he did, and it was. So that's sort of the nutshell.
Yeah. So what we had, and you can fact check me on this, is in 1978, beginning of an inflection point in the life of the country. The Republican Party is beginning to become the de facto national presidential party. Nixon has won 2 terms. President Ford nearly wins in a close race against President Carter. President Reagan's about to win 2 terms that will lead. President Bush would lead to another. So that's 12 years of one party Republican rule. And Tennessee, which is border state, but had produced in the 1950s and 60s a vice presidential running mate on the Democratic side, Estes Kefauver. You had Al Gore Sr., a big Democratic state for a long time. It's shifting. It's becoming, to be anachronistic, it's becoming more purple. And what you had in 1978, at kind of the heart of this, is the Democratic leadership in the state goes to the Republican governor-elect in order to swear him in early, in order to remove a corrupt Democratic incumbent. Yeah. A remarkably statesmanlike thing to do. And I hate to say it, but kind of unimaginable today, at least if you live in the sort of the partisan laser tag world. So you had something in the DNA of the state that was about a devotion to a kind of constitutional conversation, right? That the good of the state outweighed the particular partisan impulses of the moment. And that, if you agree, that is sort of sets the stage for your argument about that era in Tennessee politics where there was an immense amount, relatively speaking, of bipartisan cooperation.
No.
So I'm wondering, when you look back on that period, do you see, what do you see as the causes, the underlying sources of what was a functional unity, without being sentimental? It just was, right? Why was Tennessee different in those years, in the in-between times?
Well, you used a good word a moment ago when you kind of put Tennessee in its position as a border state. So, one of the stories that it's important to remember, Tennessee was the last state in the Confederacy to come out of the Union, but right before Civil War hostilities broke out, and was then the first state back in as soon as the hostilities ended. And that's an important fact. Is this sort of ambivalence about what is our position in the country, and and of course, out of that conflict, the Civil War and slavery versus abolition politics, that hit Tennessee squarely. You had a lot of a legacy, I might say, left over from that. I mean, why East Tennessee traditionally, in my lifetime, has voted Republican. Well, this was the party of Abraham Lincoln, generally pro-abolition, anti-slavery. Whereas Middle and West Tennessee, we've got this. We have to remember this strange, elongated state and how all of the economy and the agricultural base worked. And really, in some ways, to this day, I mean, I'm being very general here, but those voting patterns, in a big, sort of heavy-handed way of looking at it, have remained. And so now there are exceptions here and there, but and then in terms of what changed and kind of what we think of as the great transition in Tennessee politics was how, in the face of that history, that voting tradition, if you will, you had a lot. There were untold numbers of traditional Democrats who switched and became Republicans. Now there are a lot of, that's a whole other story, but and that's certainly national in scope and not just our state-based story. But there was the in the 1960s, there was the civil rights movement and the reaction to that. There was certainly the Vietnam War and the reaction to that, and then the reaction to that reaction. And so many people who had been, as I say, traditional Democrats became voting Republicans, and they've remained that way for a long time. So that changed the the dynamic. What I like to say is that as interesting as elections are, and they are important, is what happens between elections that is the most important. I mean, what do the people, the men and women who become elected leaders, do once they're in with their power? And so now it was important during that period, that transition, that you had important Democrats. Even so, I think of Ned McWhorter from West Tennessee, who kind of continued to go by their own lights and became leaders in the party, and that would become so that there. I'm just trying to sort of paint the picture that there was a whole lot more going on in American politics than what was happening in Tennessee, but Tennessee became an important story.
So we have a period of significant bipartisan, even if it's just defined as elected people, right? You have Republicans serving with Democrats, cats and dogs, you've got governors, Alexander to McWhorter to Sundquist, right? So you have these voting patterns that are producing a curiously, from the perspective of 2022, a curiously bipartisan electorate. One of my favorite questions, and I pose it to you, is that in 1990, in this state that's able to discern somewhat based on personality, somewhat based on results, sometimes the Democrats win, sometimes Republicans win. 1990, Al Gore Jr. carries all 95 counties when he's running for his second term in the United States Senate, a job that, again, in this climate, it's hard to imagine. Howard Baker, Republican majority leader, future White House chief of staff to Ronald Reagan, his seat is taken by Al Gore Jr., who becomes a Democratic vice president and this remarkable global figure about climate. So, as you've seen in your work and articulated, you have this. It's just an interesting microcosm, and remarkable seeming things happen. So Al wins all 95 counties. I actually asked him recently who ran against him in 1990, and he couldn't remember, which no politician has ever forgotten who ran against them. 10 years later, the loss of Tennessee to George W. Bush costs Al Gore the Electoral College and the presidency. What happened in those 10 years?
I was interested in your comment that you were recently talking to Al Gore. I spoke with him just last week, and really for an interview relating to a new book project that I've been working on, and he was very helpful. So he, and I think who that was in 1990 on the Republican side may have been Victor Ashe.
No, that was 84. No one can remember this. If neither you nor Al Gore can remember this. Victor ran, Ambassador Ashe, Mayor Ashe, he ran the first time.
Yeah, okay.
I'm the only person who cares about this on the whole planet.
Well, obviously. Yeah. I've gotten to know a fella who you may know and know him better than I do, but Professor Tony Badger. He's a Brit from the UK, and he became the biographer of Senator Gore Sr. Some people who knew both men would say that a form of what happened to Senator Gore Sr., the father, actually it befell the son. And when somebody says that, they're usually referring to the distraction of national issues, meaning a distraction away from state roots and so forth. And that was said of Al Gore Jr. When he ran for president. I think some of that, and in the case of Gore Sr., there was a lot having to do with the Vietnam War, foreign relations, that caused this sort of perceived breakage in terms of how close he remained to his Tennessee roots. The statement has been made that if Gore had carried his own home state of Tennessee, which he did not do, then Florida and all of that, Bush and Gore would not have mattered. It wouldn't have gotten that. It would not have gotten that far. So I think that's part of the answer. I think you had the way in which the Republican campaigns were conducted, and
well, I think for what it's worth, I've thought a lot about this. I'm trying to get some Vanderbilt graduate student or someone to write about this. No one has taken me up on it. I call it the 95 county problem, right? To carry all 95 counties. And so he does it in 1990. And then you think, okay, well, something happened in those 10 years. So you think, well, the state's becoming more conservative. He's out of sync. Okay, that's a proposition. Okay, but in 1992 and in 1996, the day before yesterday, in American political terms, both Clinton and Gore carry the state for the presidency. So something happened arguably between 96 and 2000. And I submit that it was which you've alluded to, it was the increasing nationalization of campaigns.
Yeah. That
Fox News goes on in 1996. Talk radio is, as from 1987, 88 forward, is significant. I think Jim Sasser would tell you that one of the reasons he had trouble winning a fourth term was because of the assault weapons ban vote, the crime bill vote, the guns in 1994. And that was being hammered as a wedge issue as opposed to a substantive one. And so in an interesting way, I think you can see at least manifestations of this nationalized politics we have now in Tennessee with the story of these very important American figures, Al Gore and Lamar Alexander, who goes on to become a senator in this divided era. And I think what a lot of us citizens, broadly put, are trying to figure out is, without making the perfect the goal, is what can we do to create a more at least vaguely rational political conversation where reflexive partisanship is not automatically rewarded. Partisanship is fine, right? I mean, that's popular government.
Right.
But my argument, for instance, is that reflective partisanship, that is, okay, my first thought is to be with my team, and that's okay. But I at least want to listen about the issue, because it's just possible, to quote your old friend and someone I admired enormously, Senator Baker, the other fellow might be right every once in a while. And so I think there's this, I think one of the things that comes out of your work, certainly in Coup and certainly in Crossing the Aisle, is that there was this tendency, not dispositive, not universal, but just real and relevant enough to think, the other fellow might be right? This guy, for instance, this mayor from Nashville, Phil Bredesen, he's done a good job up there. We're going to say the fact that we had a Democratic governor into 2010 is kind of remarkable in this climate. It's unthinkable today, almost. Right?
Well, I'd like to seize on a point you made just a moment ago, and that is the nationalization of our politics. And we can talk about Bredesen in this category too, because Phil Bredesen, a very successful mayor of Tennessee's capital city, had been a successful governor. Cooperated. He continued to work across the aisle, in particular with Governor Bill Haslam on education improvement and policy and so forth. But and yet, when he ran for the U.S. Senate, he lost by a significant margin to the Republican nominee, and it wasn't much about policy issues. It had a lot to do with the fact that President Trump came into Tennessee 3 times and did that thing he does with his rallies. And I remember watching the first of those 3 on TV, and the Republican nominee, Marsha Blackburn, didn't hardly got a word in, because I think Trump only gave her about 2 minutes to say her piece, and he went on for 45 or more minutes. And I think that's just sort of one tip of the iceberg about how things are so different today. The other thing you said, John, that rings the big bell with me is how the nationalization of issues and politics has also been made more possible by a falling away of the traditional role of newspapers. You and I both started our careers working for Tennessee newspapers, and there was a time which we can well remember when, if you're in the state legislature and you show up for a session in the morning, probably a copy of the Nashville Tennessean is there on your desk with whatever they've chosen to put on the banner headline, Chattanooga newspaper and so forth. That doesn't much happen anymore. And that leads to kind of the other thing, which in more recent times has been manifested by the, we can call it gerrymandering or we can call it redistricting, but what that has done in Tennessee, among other states, of course, has been the causing us, kind of the rest of us, to realize how closely gerrymandering relates to extremism. This legislative agenda in Tennessee, largely agreed to by Governor Bill Lee, on everything from guns to abortion politics and so forth, has been, you can't really avoid the word extremism. And I think that's one thing has led to another, because a lot of folks who serve in the legislature now, and I would apply this also to Governor Lee and his office, I don't think they feel like they need to explain very much. There's not a particularly curious Capitol Hill press corps as there used to be. And then now we're about to have this sort of whole ballot of congressional elections based on the congressional redistricting that is pretty darn weird. I mean, Nashville will not have within Davidson County a congressman, unless there's an upset or two, who lives in Davidson County. And now we'll see how that plays out. And I'm not trying to predict that, but it's the primaries already have been quite odd.
So one of the things that you've written about is the connection between this sense of unity in the state in the late 20th century, early 21st century, and the prosperity of the state. That is, Lamar Alexander goes to Japan to get investments. The ability of Tennessee, like every other state, which desperately wants jobs and investment, it's been a pretty good story. And you've argued, and the folks you've written about have argued, that their capacity to present this, they wouldn't put it this way, but we're not crazy, right? This is a state where people of different political persuasions can feel comfortable. As you go around Nashville and the state today, is there any anxiety that because of the factors you've mentioned, the increasing ideological purity of the state legislature, is there any sense that perhaps businesses are going to look at Tennessee not as a place that is fairly congenial to both sides, and might begin to see it as so ruby red that they have to take that into consideration? Do you hear that chatter at all?
Not only that, but we've seen it happen. I mean, I guess the most famous case is the state of North Carolina, where how do you properly label public restrooms? For goodness sakes,
Right.
That has played out in terms of large employers making decisions to go somewhere else. And in that, and you make a good story about Tennessee, and they saw how Alexander had in the first place. Well, actually, if you step back one big step further into the past, it was actually a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, who was president, urged all the governors. And Alexander tells this story, he remembers it very vividly, going to a kind of National Governors Association luncheon or something at the White House, President Carter, and President Carter said, governors, go to Japan and help us urge them to make in the U.S. what they sell in the U.S. That sounds a very simple proposition, but it meant the world. And so Alexander and other governors took him up on it. And that played out, that continued to play out. Of course, Tennessee became the winner of that lottery, but with a lot of hard, diligent, and bipartisan cooperation with Democrats across the state. But I mean, that's a wonderful story about partisanship in the late 70s and early 80s.
Keel, I'm going to ask you, what if anything gives you hope today for the future of American democracy?
Well, I think my personal hope and my hope for the country is that we get to a point of reconciling what I still fundamentally believe is the feeling and belief of most of our countrymen, and that is that the rule of law matters, that we need to hold our public officials to account. I mean, you don't have to get to the subject just yet of Donald Trump and what's he done and what should he be held accountable for to know that that's true. And so I wrote in the column last week that as I move around, I'm picking up on a lot of anxiety, unsettledness, in our country, in our communities, to the point of, so you can't help feeling that something is wrong here. Something is wrong. And and I think it plays out. I'm just now starting to read John Martin's new book,
Yeah.
which so far is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And he makes and his co-author make the point that this nationalization of our issues is so profound and really so harmful, so destructive in the way it plays out, that communities, leaders need to help us get back to that. Now, I think we've, this is not the same. This is very different. And you're correct in pointing this out, of course, that, the stories that we tell ourselves about what happened in Tennessee, a border state, in the 80s and 90s is relevant to, if for only reasons of contrast, to understand our current day. But that's true. And so, reapportionment, redistricting this last time around did turn into significant gerrymandering. And so you not only have, there's always going to be a race, there's always going to be a winner and loser maybe, but what the victors do with their newly won power makes all the difference. One of the reasons I believe that it's what happens between elections that's the most important. And what, if I'm understanding him right, what John Martin has been saying is that, you have this unusual time now where it's not enough to win the election and to get into office, but recently elected governors, even mayors, certainly school board members in Tennessee, because the apparatus has now supported making local school board races partisan, so that what you see them doing is kind of doubling down and governing. Okay, you won the election, but rather than move back to the middle on policy to have reasonable discussions, they are steering hard right, and that's happened in Tennessee. So I'd like to see that corrected. Would be my preference.
Is there one thing, as you move around and you think just in your personal life, is there anything that gives you hope that there is a capacity for unity? Is there a person, some sign you see that, if we can do more of that, we're going to be okay?
One person does not come to mind, unfortunately, at the moment, but we're going to have to save ourselves. I was in to me, an interesting discussion yesterday. What is the future of the Democratic Party in Tennessee? And if it has one, and I was reminded how when I was a young reporter at the Tennessean newspaper in the late 60s, I was conscious that there were Republicans around, none in my house at home, but and that the notion of a Tennessee Republican Party, which had been prominent previously, was no longer, had really kind of sunk to the level of theory. It was sort of a concept. And you had some good people who hope to make it a reality again. But my point is that I think the Democrats need to understand that's where their party is now. This is why we're seeing on the part of other, kind of the broader public, so much discussion, right or wrong, about the idea of a third party. This is why people say that, and the sort of establishment needs to hear that. And so it's not just a question of, okay, Bredesen got beat by Blackburn and she'll be in office for X years. It's not just a question of who will run, who might be willing to take that on, because that's already a pretty uphill discussion to have with anybody. Nobody wants to lose like that. Nobody wants to have to withstand that kind of campaign against you. It's a project, as I see it, that has to unfold on multiple tracks. It is about money too, fundraising and leadership, and it's also about ideas, and so that really gives me concern about our country.
Keel Hunt, thank you, my friend, for your work and for taking this time with us. And we hope you'll come back when everything is fine again.
Right. Yeah, let's wait for that day. Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks, Keel.